if you have not appointed a AIFM, your fund as of January 1st will be without an AIFM. That means you fall out of the AFMD directive. That means you're not qualified, and that would actually trigger the need for liquidating the fund.
Is Brexit really going to hit the UK private equity industry as badly as that? Let's find out some more. Well, we're now in 2021 and Brexit has happened. The transition period is over. So what does that mean for the private equity industry in the UK and Europe? Well, two of the main impacts of Brexit are firstly the fact that services are not included in the trade deal signed between the EU and the UK, and financial services are part of that. And secondly, professional qualifications are no longer recognised. So a UK lawyer or other specialist no longer has the ability to have their professional qualifications recognised in the European Union. So let's explore this in a little bit more detail. So the first aspect of the withdrawal agreement between the UK and the EU is that the professional qualifications of experts are no longer automatically recognised. So, for example, a UK qualified lawyer or a UK qualified accountant in particular will no longer have their qualification automatically recognised in the EU. And that will make some restrictions for them to exercise their profession on a pan-European basis. The second major factor which has been impacted by the withdrawal of the UK is financial passporting. The possibility that if you are registered in one country as a fund manager in this particular case, your qualification or your registration is automatically accepted or passported to the other EU countries. And now with the UK withdrawing, that is no longer the case, which means that UK registered fund managers no longer able to automatically passport their qualifications across the EU. So on a first look, we've got a barrier that's gone up between the UK and the rest of Europe, which means that you can't, as a fund manager based in London, carry on as you were before, particularly or especially if you are investing in European private equity. There's a restriction on the fund manager, and there's also going to be a restriction on their London-based support network of lawyers, accountants, and the others. So let's try and figure out how this is going to work in practice. So let me talk about this topic in three parts. The first, I want to talk a bit about offices and people, and then secondly about regulation, thirdly about politics. And let's now start and talk about offices. One of the other main factors that will affect UK private equity or London private equity post-Brexit is obviously the change in immigration rules. Now that the UK has moved to a points-based system, this effectively represents an obstacle to employ EU nationals in London, and that may affect private equity funds in London which operate on a pan-European basis. So let's get a view on that.
And then on the hiring side, as a European fund, we're quite proud of the international DNA within our team, and obviously now with the new regulations in place, it's going to become harder to get access to the best talent across Europe, because there'll be frictions around getting access to visas.
So what we heard is that this fund manager feels that it's going to become harder to get access to talent. Now, obviously, private equity professionals are quite highly qualified professionals, so I imagine that they would have no real particular difficulty getting through a UK points system because of the support they would get from the HR department of the fund, and because of their very high level of qualifications, which could be customized for the position. So it's not so much a problem of them getting through the points system. The issue might come more as to whether these professionals wish to make their permanent or long-term home in the UK because of some of the restrictions they might find for their families in terms of residence, children's education and the like. So my expectation is that it will remain relatively easy to hire more junior people, but people with families and children will feel there's more of a barrier than there used to be in terms of moving to the UK. So there should definitely be an impact, and that will inevitably mean that the pan-European funds will relocate some of their operations onto the continent of Europe. I'd like to start by talking about the various private equity funds in Europe, where they're located, and where the people working in private equity are centred, and how big these relative centres are with each other. So let's quote a couple of studies and then maybe draw some conclusions. So there was a study by ESCP in 2019 which showed a sample of major European private equity firms, and it found that there was 59 in the UK, 41 in France and Benelux, 57 in the German area, 39 in the Nordic area, 26 in Central Europe, and 44 in Southern Europe, which suggests quite a wide spread of firms across the different European nations. Let's try and reconcile that with a survey done by Pricewaterhouse, by PwC in 2020, where they were showing European buyout volume across the years 2018 and 19. And in their survey, it showed that UK and Ireland accounted for 20%, France for 17%, Benelux for 12%, Germany 13%, Nordics 14%, Iberia 8%, Italy 8%, Central Europe 4%, and Austria and Switzerland 3%. So again, suggesting a kind of spread pan-European wise of the private equity deals that were being done. If we consider the number of people employed in private equity, it's quite difficult to get detailed studies. There was a Preqin study in 2009, which is quite out of date. It showed a very big concentration in the UK, which has changed a lot as the European market has grown. But I would estimate that the main centres for private equity in terms of numbers of people would be London, Frankfurt, Munich and Paris at the top level, with obviously London in the lead, because a lot of private equity funds that work globally or in other markets are also based in London. And then a second tier consisting of Berlin, Milan, Warsaw, Vienna, Madrid, Stockholm. And roughly speaking, that's how you could break it out in terms of the people employed and the various hubs involved. So what could we expect from Brexit from the point of view of company operations and the flow of deals? Well, the Pricewaterhouse survey found that 60% of the respondents of the surveys thought that Brexit would make the UK less attractive for private equity investment, and it was felt that Germany would probably be the main beneficiary of Brexit because of the political stability and the high supply of companies, which could represent attractive investment opportunities. So let's now talk about the effect of regulation. Now, we've talked about the wider regulations, about things like restrictions on professional qualifications and points-based immigration, which is a kind of a wider context. But the key regulatory issue with Brexit is the European Directive on Alternative Fund Managers of 2011 and its application, as well as the Financial Markets Regulation, MiFID 1 and 2. And these are the two which are going to have the most impact on the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. So what Brexit means is that a UK-based alternative fund manager who was registered under the EU regulations now has lost their passport, so they can no longer operate in continental Europe if they're registered in the UK. Although there is some provisions for mutual recognition which are going to stay in place, but there is going to be a big impact on new fund managers or fund managers currently setting up their operations. So let's assume that you are a UK-based alternative fund manager, you've lost your passport, and you decide you want to persevere and continue working out of London. Well, that means in terms of regulations that you would then fall under Article 42 of the directive, which means you would have to conduct yourself under the private placement regime of the different EU countries. Now, the complication of this is that each country has applied the EU private placement regime in a slightly different way, so you would have to choose which countries in which you would operate under the private placement regime. So let's hear this from an expert.
So from the 1st of January, any UK managers currently relying upon AFMD passports to market funds in the EU won't be able to do so anymore. The good thing about it, I mean, talk about AIFs here and the AFMD regime. The good thing is that that already envisages a third country manager regime. And so there is already a framework for how a non-EU manager, which is what a UK fund initiator would be after the 1st of January, how they would market. And the way it does that is through the Article 42 regime. And that gives each member state the option to have a national private placement regime to enable non-EU managers to market funds in their jurisdiction. I think the key bit just to focus on, though, is it kind of piggybacks off the underlying national private placement regime in each jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions have just basically copy and pasted Article 42, so it's effectively just the requirements of the directive. But other jurisdictions have got additional requirements on top.
Then let's say you are a fund manager in the UK and you decide, no, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up an alternative fund manager in a EU jurisdiction such as Luxembourg or Ireland, and then I can operate pan-European based on the passport of that alternative fund manager. And then you may be tempted to say, well, look, I've got all my people in London, everything is based in London, so why don't I just set up a kind of symbolic fund manager in Luxembourg who's officially the fund manager, and then he will just subcontract everything back to me in London. Well, not so fast, because you now fall under the problem of dual hatting and the restrictions on secondment. Let's hear again from an expert.
What the Luxembourg authority clearly says is they do not want to have a UK individual having a secondment agreement with a Luxembourg MiFID or Manco company and simply traveling into Germany, Spain and France and then going back home. And for these traveling days, they use then their secondment agreement to do business.
The whole concept of a letterbox entity, you need to have real substance in your AFIM. It's nothing really new. And I think it's come to light because when everyone was trying to set up their new entities in Europe or utilize existing ones, I think the EU has been very clear that you can't just be, one person sat in a room with a pen and paper and everything really happening back in the UK. For most of our clients that have been setting up in Luxembourg, I think they've been expected to have 3 full-time equivalent employees based in that office. So I think objectively, most of us would say that's still quite a skinny operation. I think in practice, most of our clients end up having something a bit beefier around that.
So what seems to have come out of this is that if you are going to have an AIFM in Luxembourg or not in the UK on which you rely for passporting, it's going to have to be some kind of substantial operation. That means either having a sufficient number of people in Luxembourg or in the jurisdiction to make it a credible operation for the local authorities, or alternatively hiring a third-party AIFM who would then re-engage the manager. But that means that you have to have, as your at least nominal fund manager, a third party who may put their own views and not necessarily act purely as a service provider, but will have to provide oversight on the investment decisions, which may be something quite uncomfortable for fund managers who are really hoping that a third party AIFM would just be a rubber stamping body. So for the third part, let's turn to the politics of it, which is probably the most fun and contentious part, and that is the question of Brexiteers as fund managers. Now, we know the results of the UK referendum. It was Leave 52%, Remain 48%. And does that really reflect how UK fund managers might view it? Well, we can look at the breakdown of Leave and Remain by degrees, which I think would be the only real proxy we could have, because most fund managers are graduates, have degrees, often very advanced degrees. So in this case, Remain, amongst graduates in the UK, Remain was 78% and Leave was 22%. So that may allow us to reasonably suppose that only 22% of PE fund managers are potentially Brexiteers, which is irrelevant if you're managing a fund that invests in Africa or America, but may be relevant if you're investing in a pan-European fund.
We have received one question, which is, would it be a good idea to do a survey on UK private equity managers to see the percentage of Brexiters and also pro-Europe in order to know if then where the community stands and which attitude the other players could take concerning that. Would that make sense in your eyes? Or has it been done in the past?
We haven't done a survey about, and I don't think we ever would make a survey about our members' political standing. I'm not entirely sure we would be allowed under GDPR to actually collect their answers to that effect. I think about 35% of our members are UK based, but I don't see them being members of, well, they might actually be members of Invest Europe, whether they're Brexiteers or not, but they are members of Invest Europe because they know that the regulation in Europe matters. Of course, they might still hate it, so they might be Brexiteers. I'd be massively curious to find out what our members are thinking about the issues that I care about, but as an association, I don't think we'll gain much from knowing this.
Let's continue and try and piece together this Brexiteer puzzle. So I'd like to refer now to a survey called British Social Attitudes, which was done in 2014, which showed the British people's attitude to whether they felt European, whether they described themselves as British European or Scottish European and so forth. And it turns out that only 15% of the British population felt themselves to be European, but graduates, the percentage rose to 29%. So perhaps we could then use this as a proxy to express the fact that perhaps 29% of all British private equity fund managers feel themselves to be European. If we then apply that 29% to the results of the referendum as they pertain to graduates, which was 22% leave and 78% remain, then we can then split the 78% remain into 29% of convinced Europeans who feel they're European and 49% who I would describe as transactional Europeans, so people who are believing to be part of the EU for convenience. And so that gives us Brexiteers 22%, transactional Europeans 49%, and Europeans with conviction at 29%. So the question is, if you are a Brexiteer, can you really function in the financial services industry if you work on a pan-European basis? Well, obviously, yes. If you're part of the financial markets is something where you're somewhat detached. So there's absolutely no problem with you being a currency trader and a Brexiteer and trading euros, Swiss francs, and other European currencies apart from the euro. That's not a problem. Or being some kind of investment banker. But if we turn to private equity, what's the difference with the private equity asset class? Well, you're quite involved with the companies, aren't you? You're going to be on the board of the companies. You're going to be dealing with LPs. So if you're all working in a pan-European fund and you're a Brexiteer, how are people in the company in Luxembourg or the board you sit in Spain take it that you're on board of their company, which is in the heart of Europe, but you're a Brexiteer? Or how will the LPs putting money in your fund take it that you're a Brexiteer but yet investing in Europe? So there could be potentially some contradictions in being a Brexiteer and working on a pan-European basis, because at least people might ask you the question. And it's probably a little bit of a stretch, because as a private equity fund manager, you are still a citizen of the UK or of Europe, depending on how you feel about it, and it will come up. And being certainly some kind of a radical Brexiteer is probably incompatible with being a pan-European private equity fund manager. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this attempt that I've made to try and make sense of Brexit from a European private equity point of view. So what we've seen is, three big conclusions in my view. I think firstly that there's probably going to be some flow of staff away from London to some of the other major private equity centres such as Paris, Frankfurt, Milan and others. That's inevitable because of the barriers that have been put up to immigration. Secondly, regulation is going to make it more difficult for a fund manager concentrated in London to carry on as usual with a pan-European business without really having more substance on the ground. So that's also going to be a material effect, because there's going to be a renewed spotlight shone on the letterbox operations. And then thirdly, attitudes of Europeans are going to shift, and that will affect private equity as well. And it stands to reason that it's more logical if you are a British private equity fund manager working on a pan-European fund, that if you have sympathy to Europe, it's going to make it easier for you to be credible with your investee companies and with your LPs. Otherwise, you would have the difficult job of selling this idea that you like Europe, but you don't like EU institutions, which is a complicated idea to sell. So I think it's going to be better to be a pro-European if you are a fund manager working out of the UK rather than a rabid Brexiteer.